I'm Inwood Lane and I'm speaking. In this installment, I'm going to do some quick house cleaning, but then the main thrust of this installment is about the prop the Project 2025 war and the current administration's war against social progress. In fact, if you really look at it, they are against really the 14th Amendment. In fact, there's been some news. There are some things that have occurred in current events or in recent events that traces back to the 14th Amendment. So we're going to get right into it, starting with the house cleaning. The house cleaning involves using the wrong reference of diversity, equality, and inclusion. The correct reference is diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's been a couple of recent installments in which I used that phrase. By definition, equality means treating everyone the same. By definition, equity is giving people what they need to be successful. Basically, accommodations that enables someone to function and succeed. The other bit of house cleaning involves my most recent installment, in which I received, in my recent installment, in which there was a comment that was retracted by the subject of the installment, in which I said a black Trump supporter reminded just who he really is by Phoenix police. So he sends me a comment. He comments on my upload, in which he says, "Sir, you need to be very careful saying that I jaywalked. You need to retract your statement. There's no jaywalking statute in Arizona. Pursuant to Arizona Revised Statutes 28793, Arizona law says that if I cross at any other point other than a crosswalk, I must yield to traffic, which I did. Be very careful with what you say because you may be opening yourself to legal action for defamation. I'm sick of folks lying out of their mouths. Be very careful. You can see the Arizona legislature website and statute information below." And so I click the link, and it says pedestrian crossing a roadway at any point other than within marked crosswalk or within unmarked crosswalk at an intersection shall yield the right of way to all vehicles on the roadway. Pedestrian crossing a roadway at a point where a pedestrian tunnel or overhead pedestrian crossing has been provided shall yield the right of way to all vehicles on the roadway. Between adjacent intersections at which traffic control signals are in operation, pedestrians shall not cross at any place except in the marked crosswalk. So the statute says crossing at other than a crosswalk, but in everyday terms, it is jaywalking. So that is what he was at odds with me about, but he retracted the comment. So again, I use the term jaywalking. If you were to poll 100 people and ask them if a person crosses a street other than a crosswalk, the overwhelming majority would say jaywalking. Now, the main thrust of this installment is about my pointing out how there is this massacre that's going on that's not at this point by bullets and guns and blood being shed, but it's a massacre between ears. So what I wanted to explore more was into where all the pushback began by the right wingers thinking. And at first I thought it was going back to Brown versus Board of Education, which was the watershed moment in the second half of the 20th century. After reading more material, that may be viewed as directly related to the current administration's outright assault against education, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and for that matter, against blacks, women, handicapped people, and other non-European Anglo-Saxon ethnic groups. So yes, that means, among others, Muslims, Asians, and Latinos. I realized that at the core of this ideological massacre that is occurring right before our eyes traces all the way back to the resistance against the passing of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The best way I can share how I've begun processing these things was noting, or at least understanding, that the 14th Amendment's passing ushered in an era of actual progress for former enslaved Black people. Personally, I'm a descendant who is at most 5 generations removed from slavery. So, in the broader context of history, that's not far away. I'm also old enough to say that I was born into Jim Crow. That era of progress was shelved and boxed upon the U.S. Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, which said, hey, separate but equal. That same year in 1898 was the Wilmington, North Carolina massacre that I've only become knowledgeable of within the past year. Other noted massacres of Black communities in this country that I'm aware of or have been aware of for decades now are the ones that occurred in Rosewood, Florida, and in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And for me, the Tulsa, Oklahoma atrocity hits home because I had a second cousin who lived there. I've even hung out there briefly during my childhood with my mother as my uncle, her brother, relocated there in his early years after graduating from Oklahoma State. Not once did I ever hear any mentioning of what occurred in Tulsa, which for me basically was 1, maybe 2 generations before me. In all those examples, the massacre that was inflicted upon the Black community had irreparable damage. These communities no longer exist or thrive economically. They were, in effect, exterminated. Plessy versus Ferguson was the prevailing law of the land for the next 2 going on 3 generations. That was until Brown versus Board of Education, which argued on the grounds of the 14th Amendment that segregation in public schools was unlawful. It can also be said that further progress was made with the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It bothers me to come upon content material by uninformed people who want to remind other Black folk that Republicans were the party that first argued for the abolition of slavery and was the political party that was behind the passing of the 14th Amendment and also the freeing of the slaves through the pronouncement of the Emancipation Proclamation. Democrats, they want to say, fought tooth and nail against social progress. That's what they want to say. What they failed to recall or acknowledge is that the political party, for example, that was behind the desegregation of the military services was the Democrat Party under Franklin Roosevelt and then later Harry Truman. The New Deal, which was the underpinnings or moorings, as what the Project 2025 propagandists like to say, the moorings of the Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which was during the mid to late 1960s, was pointing back to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And it was also during that era, the mid-late to 1960s, in which an ideological shift occurred in which those Southern Democrats who were opposed to integration, they were also referred to as oftentimes Dixiecrats. These Dixiecrats found solace in the Republican Party of then Barry Goldwater and Richard Nixon. The Southern strategy was birthed during that time. It was also revived during the 1980s by Lee Atwater, as he was an advisor to many Republicans who ran for public office. Now, what came from, this is kind of a little bit of a historical lesson, but you got to understand, what came from the era of the Civil Rights Act passing and the Voting Rights Act passing was affirmative action and efforts to address long systemic racism in all facets of life. housing, insurance, banking, jobs, education, gender equity. In fact, when you talk about gender equity in 1972, there was the passing of the Title IX of the Education Amendments, or at least there was an enactment of the Title IX of the Education Amendments. I made reference to insurance because I'm also a licensed insurance agent. Um, I learned early on in my licensing that there are many stories about how insurance companies and agents, that the field agents, the guys who went out to write the business and all and collect the premiums back then, carried two books of rates. There was a book for black people, which had the higher rates, and then there was a standard lower set of rates for non-black people, particularly whites. Now, the resistance has come in various forms over the decades. They've been challenged in the courts, and there's also been legislation passed. Now they're being played out by executive action by this current administration, and it's even more lethal. This is why I say that the massacre that we've seen has not been by bullets and guns, at least so far, but it's been between the ears. So the cultural war that's being waged by the propagandists of Project 2025 is the war against wokeism, as they say. And there's been a lot of stuff in the news over the past month. The most recent that I'm going to speak of that triggered all this thinking was the current administration's directives that threaten to take away funding of local school districts that have any semblance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's also, and this would actually really stirred me doing this. There's also a lawsuit that's been filed by 17 state attorney generals, all of them Republican states, of course, seeking to have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 be deemed unconstitutional. In short, these people have issue with one item, which you may say is an inch, but they're saying, fuck it, we want to take the entire mile. And that case is called Texas versus Becerra. Now, going back to my initial my point here at this juncture, um, I need to remind you how the propagandists, the propagandists of Project 2025 have worded, or at least framed, their war against being woke or wokeism, which is used more than 30 times in that text. Now, what they're saying is the next conservative president must make the institutions of American civil society hard targets for woke culture warriors. This starts with the deleting this starts with deleting the terms sexual orientation, gender identity, diversity, equity and inclusion, gender equity, gender equality, gender awareness, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights, and any other term used to deprive Americans of their Amendment rights out of every federal rule, agency, regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists. So they have come out with an all out war, an all out assault against these gains that have been made. Now, what I also want to point out is that diversity in diversity, equity, and inclusion is the evolution of affirmative action and all of the social justice, political justice, and economic justice initiatives of the recent past. But let's go back to the 14th Amendment. What did the 14th Amendment say? The 14th Amendment says, Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And the key words are nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So they're saying, fuck all y'all. Fuck every last one of y'all. We don't agree. That's basically what they're saying. And so they're trying to do everything they can to, as they say, go back to the original moorings of the country, which means going all the way back to the 1700s, in which there was one narrow slice of society that enjoyed the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, and that was white males. So what you have to understand that this is a two-pronged assault to accomplish the desires of the oligarchy, the billionaire class that shares with the racist ideology. You've got to pay them back by giving them their tax breaks and undoing regulations that they feel restrict them from accumulating more wealth and creating their utopia. So how can that be accomplished? Well, you've got to find the money. You're not going to search from the top. You're going to search from the bottom. So to get people on board with their agenda, got to create enemies and people that might rally around your cause, your argument. Okay, so you got to create enemies, and you got to get folk to rally around your cause. So you exploit the weak and the defenseless. You play bully. At the same time, for the uninformed and the dumbasses that are antithetical, that means being indifferent, hostile, and in opposition, it doesn't take much to sway their opinions. Since these ideologues like to hide behind the cloak of God, I doubt if they realize that God is a God of both equity and fairness. God is a God of both equity and equality, you might say. In fact, if you go by chapter and verse, the Bible says that there's none righteous, not one. Everyone who has access to him, everyone has access to him who believe. And if they believe upon him, they shall be saved. That's equality. Equity is that by faith, God is more than the world against you. He meets you where you are and equips you with the tools to succeed while here on earth. The God that they're serving is themselves and among themselves. The question is what defines someone being in their social strata. The unfortunate thing I see is that this train has left the station and it's not good. I don't see how any progress will ever be made because it's likely that this shit will be swatted back and forth in the changing of presidential administrations if that occurs. Of course, a dictatorship and totalitarianism may ensure that this regime's regressive agenda is firmly entrenched. That is why they mean that they want to go back to its original moorings. That is what they mean by taking this country back to where there was only, again, a narrow segment of the populace that had full rights and privileges that was afforded to them. So that's all I have to share in this installment. I'm speaking, and I am Inwood Lane.